Good afternoon. We are here today to go over the revised speech-language eligibility criteria for the new Missouri State Plan. I'm Beth McCurley. I am a past president of MISHA and I work in North Kansas City School District. I'm here today with Pat Jones. She is MISHA president and she works in Liberty School District. And I'm also here today with Diane Golden. She is with the Association of Assistive Technology Act Programs and is retired from MOCASE. We have a few disclosures that we need to share with you today. Financial disclosures for myself. I'm employed as the Speech Language and Related Services Coordinator in North Kansas City School District. We do have a ASHA grant that provides some travel and lodging for our expenses, as well as a contract with DESE. And for my non-financial disclosures, I am a member and a past president of the Missouri Speech Language Hearing Association. I'm a member of the American Speech Language Hearing Association, and I'm also a member of MOCASE.
Pat Jones here. I am employed with Liberty Public Schools as a speech-language pathologist. For a financial disclosure, we received an ASHA grant for travel and lodging expenses, and we also have a contract with DESE. For non-financial disclosures, I'm the current MISHA president. I'm a member of America's Speech Language Hearing Association. I'm the current state education advocacy leader, the SEAL. And that I'm going to pass the mic.
Yeah.
And I'm Diane Golden. I am employed by the Association of Assistive Technology Act Programs. And again, we have a ASHA grant supporting this training along with a contract with DESE. I'm a past board member and member of Missouri Speech Language Hearing Association, member and past committee chair for the American Speech Language Hearing Association, and a member, past board member of Missouri CASE.
Speech language pathologists working in today's schools have a variety of roles and responsibilities. For purposes of today's presentation, we are talking with Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. IDEA is a federal law that requires schools to serve the educational needs of students with disabilities. The law ensures a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, for students with disabilities in all 50 states and U.S. territories. There are key principles in IDEA, such as the procedural safeguards, a free, appropriate public education, also known as FAPE, appropriate evaluation and eligibility for services, individualized education program, or IEP, least restrictive environment, or LRE, and parent participation. The federal regulations for Section 300.306 regarding determination of eligibility states that a group of professionals and the parent determines whether the child is a child with a disability as defined in Section 300.8, and the group of professionals and the parent must determine if the child needs specially designed instruction and related services. You must determine what the adverse impact is on the child's education. The child cannot be determined to be a disability if there is a lack of instruction in reading, which includes all the essential components of reading instruction, as defined in the ESEA section of the Every Student Succeeds Act, and the lack of appropriate instruction in math or limited English proficiency if they don't meet the eligibility criteria. The evaluation should draw upon information from a variety of sources, parent input, teacher recommendations, as well as information about the child's physical condition, social or cultural background, and adaptive behavior. The evaluation should also ensure that the information obtained from all these sources is documented and carefully considered. The Missouri Speech Language Hearing Association, MOCASE, and DESE had been working for years to look at possibly revising our outdated speech language eligibility criterion. We quickly became one of only 2 states utilizing cognitive referencing, which is comparing IQ scores to language scores. Most all other states have moved away from cognitive referencing, and they use a deficit model for standardized assessments, and most frequently they're using 1.5 to 2.0 standard deviations from the mean of the language test. And they're using overall language, not discrete parts of language such as syntax. So in 2015-2016, conversations continued about revising this outdated eligibility criterion, and a work group of MSHA, MOCASE, higher education, DESE, and local district stakeholders established a work group and met throughout the year of 2016 to 2017 to develop recommendations for DESE that included revisions to all of the speech and language criteria. This recommendation was included in the proposed state plan for 2017, but the state plan proposal could not be finalized in 2018 due to the lack of a state board quorum. Again, in 2018, these recommendations were included in the proposed state plan, and the state board approved the plan in February of 2019 during rulemaking. The new state plan is effective as of July 30th, 2019. The initial eligibility criteria is just used for initial eligibility. These revisions apply to initial eligibility for all 4 areas of speech and language: sound system, language, voice, and fluency. This is not criteria that should be used for a reevaluation and determination for continued need of special education services, nor is this eligibility criteria that is used for determination as a related service. This criterion is only applied for initial eligibility purposes. We're first going to look at language impairment. A language impairment is present when a comprehensive assessment documents all of the following. The first prong is that the language impairment adversely affects the student's educational performance as documented by a lack of response to evidence-based interventions designed to support progress in the general curriculum. The intent with this prong of the criterion is to ensure that RTI or an MTSS type of general education intervention has been implemented before consideration for IDEA eligibility. You will see that this first prong, applies to all speech-language eligibility criteria. The adverse effect on educational performance as defined by evidence-based interventions can be curriculum-based interventions such as reading, or it can be specific speech and language interventions. These interventions can be implemented by any appropriate provider, such as a teacher, a para, an SLPA, or an SLP. The second prong of the language impairment is that a student's overall language functioning is significantly below age expectations as measured by 2 or more composite standard scores on standardized language assessments. The composite language score reflects both receptive and expressive language function in one single standard score. Significantly below is defined as 1.75 standard deviations below the mean for students who are kindergarten age eligible and older. A public agency may accept a composite score allowing for the standard error of measurement when the criterion is met on the other composite score, and the agency may adopt written procedures for utilization of reasonable variances that enable a student to meet the standard criterion score when there are highly unique situations such as English learners. So just to recap the standardized assessment component of the new language criterion, the new straight deficit of 1.75 standard deviations below the mean for the language assessment replaces the previous cognitive referencing comparison. IQ scores are no longer required. The new language criterion requires 1.75 standard deviations below the mean on 2 overall language composite scores from standardized assessments that include both receptive and expressive language skills. Standardized assessments that only look at discrete areas of language, such as a semantics or a syntax test, are not utilized for the 1.75 standard deviation below the mean criterion. Also, there is an allowance for variance in meeting the 1.75 standard deviation criterion level, including standard error of measurement and unique situations such as English learners. It is important to note with the new language eligibility criteria that young child with a developmental delay disability criteria remains unchanged. You should still continue to use YCDD for eligibility determinations for children who are ages 3 to 5 years of age, but not yet kindergarten eligible. This continues the use of YCDD deficit levels of 2 standard deviations in communication, or one area, or 1.5 standard deviations when it's paired with another developmental area for eligibility of children aged 3 through 5 who are not yet kindergarten age eligible. Again, this is not a change from the current criteria. The third prong of the new language impairment eligibility criteria is that the student consistently displays inappropriate or inadequate language that impairs communication in the student's educational environment as documented by a structured qualitative procedure, which includes a formal language sample, classroom observations, curriculum-based assessments, teacher or parent checklists or interviews, or other clinical tasks. The intent is to have authentic assessment beyond norm reference scores that document the language impairment adverse effect on educational performance in the school environment. The fourth prong of the language impairment criterion is that the language deficit is not primarily the result of dialectical differences or second language influence. This is also unchanged as it is in the current criterion. I'm going to turn this over to Diane, and she's going to go over this sound system disorder criteria.
Before we get into the criterion changes themselves, I have a couple of slides to provide some background data information that I think is important for people to understand and provide a context for the changes in the sound system criteria. The first slide provides data from Missouri Child Count. That's the December 1 count of children with IEPs that every school district provides, with the number of students identified as eligible under the language impairment criterion and sound system disorder criterion, along with voice and fluency. But the speech numbers are 99% children with sound system disorder, not voice and fluency. The table provides data from 2007 through 2018. And what I hope folks can observe by this table is that the ratio between language and speech, the numbers of students identified eligible under language and the number of students identified eligible under speech, the ratio between the two has remained relatively stable for over a decade, with far over 60%, closer to even 70% of all students identified as speech language eligible in the area of speech, which translates to sound system disorder, versus language. I'm providing this data because this is relatively inconsistent with other states and national trends. I would say the trend in other states is just the opposite. The majority of children eligible are on the language side, not the speech side. So this is an area where Missouri is out of step with many other states, and I just want people to be aware of the fact that we have far more children identified as IDEA eligible in the area of speech than other states tend to have. The next slide provides child count data for preschool, PK children, less than kindergarten eligible. And it provides data from 2001 through 2018. And a couple of things that are important to note about this data. First is the rapid growth and expansion of the numbers of students identified as speech language eligible in the early childhood PK years. In 2001, the total number of children identified eligible in speech language was 791, and in 2018, that was 4,069. That's over a 400% increase in about a decade and a half. Compare that to the change in the number of children identified as eligible under YCDD, which was 8,070 in 2001 and 8,115 in 2018. So pretty much no change in the number of children identified as eligible under YCDD. And again, not only has there been this very significant increase in number of children identified as IDEA eligible, almost all of those are speech, aka sound system. It's not voice and fluency, nor is it language. Those students who have global communication deficits are most likely qualifying as 2 standard deviations in the communication area of YCDD, or 1.5 standard deviations paired with another developmental area delay. So again, overall, Missouri has far more children identified as IDEA eligible in the area of speech only than is typical nationally or in other states. So proposed changes, not proposed, now they're final changes to the sound system eligibility criteria were at least somewhat based on the rather odd trajectory of data that has been occurring in Missouri for the past decade or so. Overall, those data trends show that speech, almost all sound system disorders, are consistently the majority of K-12 students on child count instead of language. When you add into that the numbers of students that are served who have articulation issues but are served outside of IDEA, and it becomes an even larger number of students that are receiving interventions for speech compared to any other speech language services. And again, I'll repeat, across the country, this is most focus is on language and overall communication issues, not so much sound system disorders at the K-12 level. And same thing for preschool. Those numbers for speech sound system just continue to increase while other areas appear to remain relatively stable. So the changes to sound system disorder eligibility criteria, as Beth pointed out in the language criterion, there are prongs, and the first prong of sound system is very similar to the first prong of language, which is the sound system disorder adversely affects the student's educational performance as documented by a lack of response to evidence-based interventions designed to support progress in the general education curriculum. That prong is intended, just like it is for language, to ensure that an RTI, MTSS, some sort of non-special education intervention has been tried first before moving to IDEA eligibility determinations. The next prong is the metric or the quantifier for the criterion. And that is that the student exhibits a significant delay of at least 1 year in correct sound production based on state-designated normative data in the table below, and the table is inserted in the state plan. It is not on this slide. After administering a single word test and/or sentence phrase repetition task and a connected speech sample, with consideration given to the type of error recorded, substitutions, omissions, distortions, and/or additions. Important, these errors may be described as single sound errors or errors in phonological patterns. The errors may be described as such, but having a single sound error or an error in a phonological pattern in and of itself does not constitute eligibility. The eligibility is being a year beyond the norms in the table. So very important point. However, there's always a however. If the student does not exhibit a significant delay of at least 1 year based on the normative table, but there are multiple errors in the sound system which are collectively so severe that the student's speech is unintelligible, the public agency may establish that the student has a disability, aka sound system disorder.
The third prong of the criteria is an exclusion cause. The sound system disorder is not the result of a dialectical differences or second language influence. This portion of the criteria is unchanged from the current version. In an overall summary, the sound system criteria metric provision has been changed to 1 year beyond rather than at the developmental norms used by the current criteria. Professional judgment has been eliminated and replaced by a determination that the student's speech, if unintelligible, which can be documented by an inability to communicate basic wants and needs, which will likely cause measurable deficits in a variety of development and/or academic areas.
This next slide provides a bit of an overview for reminding people about issues related to determining adverse educational impact related to sound system disorder or actually voice and fluency, any speech eligibility criteria. Adverse educational impact legally in a number of court cases always comes back to a child's ability to learn and function and perform in a general education classroom in a general education curriculum. For children with speech, sound system, voice fluency, impairments, disorders, the most reasonable way to document an adverse educational impact is by being able to point out how overall communication deficits negatively impact the child in the general education classroom, academically, their ability to matriculate through the general education curriculum and achieve reasonable achievement levels. Very frequently, school districts document adverse educational impact in the area of speech, particularly sound system disorder, by using statements like, the child's speech calls negative attention to themselves, creates some sort of implying or stating directly that it creates some sort of social emotional negative impact. I would caution people strongly about using that kind of language because if that is the adverse educational impact, then that IEP should have goals and objectives to address the negative social emotional impacts, such as counseling or some way to address these social emotional issues that are caused by the communication, the articulation, sound system disorder. I'm just providing this information as a caution so that people take seriously the adverse educational impact part of the speech criterion. It is really talking about the kinds of negative academic achievement issues that you tend to see with other disabling conditions. And again, if it's social emotional, then one would expect you to address that directly in goals and objectives, not just speech therapy per se to address an articulation error. So a word of caution. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pat, and she's going to discuss voice impairment criteria.
Yes. Voice impairment has 4 prongs, and a voice impairment is present when a comprehensive communication assessment documents all of the following. The first prong, the voice impairment adversely affects the student's educational performance as documented by lack of response to evidence-based interventions designed to support progress in the general education curriculum. The second prong, the child consistently exhibits deviations in pitch, quality, or volume. The third prong, the student's voice is discrepant from the norm as related to his or her age, sex, and culture, and is distracting to the listener. The fourth prong, the voice impairment is not a result of a medical condition that contraindicates voice therapy intervention. A temporary condition such as a normal voice changes, allergies, colds, or other such conditions, or a dialectical difference or second language influence. There's an intent for schools to establish a policy to address medical clearance for voice therapy, which has always been best practice. The next area of eligibility we're going to discuss is a fluency impairment, and it consists of three prongs. A fluency impairment is present when a comprehensive assessment documents all of the following. The fluency impairment adversely affects the student's educational performance as documented by lack of response to evidence-based interventions designed to support progress in the general education curriculum. The second prong for fluency impairment, the student's fluency is significantly below the norm as measured by speech sampling in a variety of contexts and impairs communication in the student's educational environment as documented by structured qualitative procedures such as classroom observations, curriculum-based assessments, teacher and or parent checklists and interviews, or other clinical tasks. The third prong for fluency impairment, the student consistently exhibits one of the following symptomatic behaviors of disfluency: sound, syllable, or word repetition, prolongations of sounds, syllables, or words, avoidance, blockages, and or hesitations. It is the intent to have assessment beyond any numeric data that documents fluency impairments that adversely impact educational performance in the school environment. As a work group, we analyzed 1,200 evaluations. Several districts came together in our work group: MOCASE, MISHA, DESE, other SLPs, and we applied the new criteria to 1,200 evaluations. The concern would be that the floodgates would open and the number of language, speech, fluency, and voice eligibility students would greatly increase. However, the results indicated there is not a significant change in the number of students that are eligible. However, there is a definite shift in the type of student that would be eligible. I'm going to hand the mic over to Beth McCurley.
In the beginning of the work group that was put together to review the speech language criteria, I talked earlier about how we looked at what other states were doing to get a feel for what was going on in the other states. And through a process of reviewing that information, we found that most every state has some sort of a speech language handbook or guidelines document that either the Department of Education or the Speech Language Hearing Association for that state edited and put out for speech pathologists to use in the state. So Missouri decided that we needed a handbook, the people who were working on this work group, and so MISHA led the way, and we received an ASHA State Association grant in 2017 to develop this handbook. The handbook work group met for the year of 2017 to 2018 to put together the handbook, and the purpose for the handbook is so that we can get some greater consistency in the state to improve outcomes for children, to make sure that we're aligning local, state, and federal practices, and also to ensure evidence-based practices. We published the handbook on November 1st, 2018. The handbook lives on the MISHA website. It's on the front page of the MISHA website. The handbook has also been referenced in a couple places on the DESE website, And the handbook also includes a Q&A section that has been published both on the MSHA and the DESE website. And all the information is also there about the history of the state plan changes. It is intended that now that the state plan has been finalized, that the MSHA handbook will go on to be revised again to include suggestions for speech-language pathologists and administrators in school districts to help with all the various prongs of the criteria. Examples would be including teacher checklists, observation forms, informal measures that can be utilized other than assessments, and updating the Q&A section that questions that have been obtained through the various presentations in presenting this information to the state of Missouri. So we hope that we will be able to publish another version of the handbook soon. And if you have any questions, you can contact Diane, Pat, or myself, and we will be happy to help give you some guidance. Thank you for your time today.